overall, do you sense that Connecticut is shifting, or is it fairly stable?
I think there's ebb and flow, and I think part of what we see, this district, I mean, the 5th district is an independent voter district. 43% of the voters are not registered in either party. Meaning neither of your party's party, as I think that, and I think that's a frustration with both parties. I think part of that is an increased focus on the economy right now, and I think in this district, it's a fiscal responsibility district that's socially fairly liberal, fiscally moderate, and I think at the moment, we're seeing, particularly we saw in the municipal elections last year, a resurgence of the fiscal responsibility mindset. And I think that's also reflective of both Connecticut and all of New England having a little slower economic recovery. We went in later, we're coming out later than some other regions are, and I think it's reflective of that as well. Something I've talked about with colleagues in Congress, and actually I think transportation, I'm beginning to think that transportation is actually a key piece for why New England is a little slower in economic growth. Because we have other pieces that ought to have our economies growing a little faster than they are. In fact, we have almost all the other pieces, and that piece is kind of missing for all of us.
How about the 5th district in particular, though? I know it's a difficult question, but because the towns that make up the complexion of it vary so widely from one to the other. They're thought of this town is thought of as overall Republican, this more leaning Democrat. But it seems to be shifting here and there. I'm just wondering what your perspective is.
Think about your opponent 2 years ago too, was a moderate Republican.
Exactly.
This year you're facing a conservative Democrat or a conservative Republican who has the full support of the party.
Sure.
What does that say?
Yeah.
Well, I'm not quite sure what that says. I think that says a lot of things. I mean, it also says the role of money in politics, frankly, that he was willing to spend a lot of money, had spent a lot of money, was willing to do it again. And that, sadly, at the moment matters. You become a serious candidate by having a lot of money. And you look around the country, people who would not, 10 years ago, not be considered to be serious candidates because they have no experience and they may have extreme views, either very inexperienced or very extreme, and yet they become serious candidates by virtue of the money. I think that is part of what we're seeing, and a lot of different reasons. I think I won 2 very difficult elections 2 years ago, and people who are other elected officials had a greater appreciation of how hard that was to do. It was a little intimidating, I think, frankly, to them. People didn't expect me to win, certainly not the first one, and we're not uncertain about the second one. So those who are already political elected officials, I think that was probably a concern.
What do you make of running this year in light of Malloy's tough race and what's being made of you were running in a presidential election on it's been said Obama's coattails. Now you're running.
Certainly doesn't make my job easier. It doesn't make your job easier because you have a big drop off of participation, and that's really my concern. And it's not just, it's a concern more broadly about governance. We have focused so much on winning elections that it's making it harder and harder to govern once you get elected. And if the public doesn't participate, and I would even tie this into some of what we're seeing on the debates on the national security front, and why it's part of the reason why I feel it's so incredibly important that Congress actually vote on whether we go to war or not. I think that's incredibly important because I think public participation is vital. And so I'm much less worried about vigorous disagreement. I don't think that's the threat to democracy. I think the threat to democracy is disengagement or discouragement. And that's what I worry about now, not simply as a matter of my chances of re-election, but much more broadly about whether we as a country can govern. And if people don't participate, it's all too easy to say, I didn't elect that person, I don't like what they did. Well, that's really not the point. The point ought to be, that we work on collaboration, and the more people are involved in the process, the more authority those who are elected have to try to speak for the folks they represent, and that leads to better collaborative decision making than a race to the bottom of fewer and fewer people participating and only the strident and the ideological being represented, and that makes it harder for members of Congress to work with each other. So I think it plays into and aggravates the dysfunction in Washington when people don't participate. It becomes a vicious as opposed to a virtuous cycle.
So obviously you're trying to up bipartisanship. Is there some sort of, is there a hope for increased bipartisanship in the future in Congress?
I have to tell you, in the back of the room, and I'll use the example of the Transportation Committee, which is quite bipartisan at this point. It was not under the last Congress, under John Mica, who was very strident, made no bones about being quite ideological. Current Chairman Bill Schuster's been in Connecticut 3 times, including a couple of weeks ago, to in part go to a charity fundraiser for John Larson. I mean, that's something that used to happen a lot, that members of Congress who were friends would go to each other's districts. He's from Pennsylvania. He knows for all of New England, and that includes also New York, Pennsylvania. Do we have older infrastructure? He knows it's really important. So he's been willing to come up here and look at projects with us. That used to be common, particularly on the bread and butter issues like infrastructure and transportation. So I was, delighted to be working with him on the WRDA bill, which we canceled $18 billion for projects, freeing up money, which we hope we'll be able to get the successor to Colonel Samaras, who I think some of you met when he came up here to tour the hub site with us for the Army Corps of Engineers. That used to be common, and I see signs of that coming back. Certainly the Transportation Committee's been a bright spot, and just this past week, we actually had the Amtrak reauthorization bill went through committee in a bipartisan way. And that's what's supposed to happen, because people know they have a chance to raise their issues, raise their amendments, and then withdraw them because we'll work on it harder next year. Well, that's the kind of thing. So I am seeing, green shoots of hope there. Maybe not enough. It's not as many as I would like, but I'm seeing some in the STEM education bill that I worked on with Lamar Smith.
Well, I was going to ask that. How are you working with the Republican colleagues?
Well, I'm finding the ones who want to work with me. I've done initiatives with 2 Republican Chris's from New York in the last couple of months. Chris Collins last week on a manufacturing universities bill to help support engineering programs, to give them additional support, to encourage their students to focus on manufacturing. It's something that's very important. He represents the Rochester area. Obviously we have UConn and we have their engineering program here, and this would have the federal government help support and give grants to research universities with engineering programs to support more emphasis on manufacturing, which is tremendously important for U.S. innovation and very important for Connecticut. Also worked with Chris Collins on STEM education legislation. So, that's important to him. I did brownfields with him. I worked on brownfields initiatives. I helped get brownfields money here for, $200,000 here. And for that bill, I worked with him on brownfields, and he came to me with his Lyme disease bill that he'd been working on. So I'm finding the people, there are people in Congress who do want to do this. Those are the people I'm finding and working with, and face it, there's some people on both sides of the aisle who like to pound the podium and get in front of the TV, who like the ideological battle. That has never been my thing. That's not what I'm interested in. I'm interested in being effective.
But you're speaking mostly, I think, about bipartisanship within the House, right, and committees. But the way things are shaping up in the Senate, the prognosis is that it may this time go Republican. And if that's true, how do you get good bills in the House passed through a recalcitrant Senate? I mean, how?
Well, I think you can say, given what the rules are right now about filibuster, it's very hard to get things through anyway, regardless of which party is in control. I would say, again, the same thing is true, though, David. You find things where you think there's support for bipartisanship. Manufacturing is one, infrastructure and transportation is one. I would hope we could do it on immigration reform. I would hope we could do it on comprehensive tax reform. These are things that actually have bipartisan support. They may not have support. Leadership may view it differently as to how it plays out electorally, but I'm worried more about governance than elections. Because at the end of the day, for someone who was a PTA mom, in 2005 when I decided to run for local office, I'm not interested in doing this job unless I can get things done. I didn't run to sort of work my way up in leadership and have some fancy title. I worked to try to get some things done.